Today's episode has a very fitting title, The Lone Wolf. Gregory Lone was truly a wolf in sheep's clothing. Lone purchased a long-standing insurance company based in Wenatchee, Washington, and he specifically targeted older customers who were looking to invest in annuities to help provide a stable financial future. Instead, he stole from 7 older investors to help feed his Ponzi scheme, putting their financial future in question.
Hello, and welcome to Real Life Regulators, a podcast aimed at educating investors using real cases. This podcast is brought to you by the North American Securities Administrators Association, also known as NASA. I'm Jeremy Lachine, webmaster for the Washington State Department of Financial Institutions, and I will be serving as one of your hosts. And today, my co-host is Francois Grayson, Assistant Director for the Utah Division of Securities.
Thanks, Jeremy. And joining us today are Financial Legal Examiner Adam Yaton and Financial Examiner for Michelle Mack, both from the State of Washington Department of Financial Institutions Securities Division.
We are here to talk about what happened, what went wrong, and what you can do in the future to best protect yourself from securities fraud.
Before we get into the case, let's start off and tell us a bit about who you are and what you do. Adam, we'll start with you.
Sure, and thanks very much for having us. So, my name is Adam Yaton. I'm a financial legal examiner here at DFI. I am in the enforcement unit of the Securities Division. And so what that means is that we investigate potential violations of the Securities Act primarily, and then some of the other acts that the Securities Division administers as well. But I'd say probably 80% or so is securities and securities-related stuff. And so in terms of the day-to-day, we get complaints. We interview the people who submit those complaints. We get documents and review them. We interview the folks who, may have sold securities and deceived people about them. So it can look pretty different on a day-to-day basis. But generally speaking, I investigate potential violations of the Securities Act.
All right, thanks. That sounds like a cool job. And Michelle, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
All right, again, thank you for having me as well. I am a financial examiner here in the enforcement unit as well. We're also sometimes referred to as analysts in the everyday sense of the word. I am a certified fraud examiner, and I have been here at DFI for the past 20 years. I also do handle initial complaints that come in to our agency, and the bulk of my role is financial investigations. So in that, we subpoena bank records, reconstruct those bank records, and determine the source and use of those funds, of those investor funds. And in some of those investigations are in fact criminal. And in those investigations, we work with local and federal prosecutors and law enforcement agencies in the prosecution of those cases.
The subject of today's case is Gregory Lone, who operated a Ponzi scheme in Wenatchee, Washington. Adam and Michelle, can you briefly describe the case?
Sure. So Mr. Lone was an insurance agent out of the Wenatchee area, which is a town in central Washington. And Mr. Lone ran a Ponzi scheme against primarily elderly investors that he was fortunately prosecuted for.
Adam, can you tell us a little bit about Lone's background? And by that, I mean, was he married? Did he have a family? What was his home like? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, so he had a pretty nice house, as I recall. Michelle had looked it up at one point during the case and could probably speak to that in more detail. He was married, I believe, 2 kids. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he was a financial professional generally, I would say. He was mainly working in the insurance industry. He did have a little bit of history in the securities industry, but I think hadn't been registered since 2006, if I remember right, and had mainly been focused on insurance since that point.
And in terms of his community outlook and the home and such that he lived in Wenatchee, I would deem that he would be probably upper middle class, lived high on a hill with a rather expansive home, territorial views of vineyards, and I believe the Columbia even in the picture. So he definitely had the picture of that he was doing well.
He also was a part owner of a winery in the area.
Interesting. Can you describe the town of Wenatchee a little bit?
Sure. It's about 150 miles east of Seattle. its population is around 35,000. And just a little food for thought, no pun intended. It is the apple capital of the world, which I learned during this investigation.
Yeah.
It's small town vibe. There's a lot of football, baseball, you can tell, fields and activities amongst the locals. Even though it's not super small of a few thousand, it does have a very small town feel. It's very picturesque, mostly sunny days, gorgeous territorial views. It's a real quaint place to live.
Yeah, very, very agricultural. I'd say it's a pretty big town for Eastern Washington, but Eastern Washington is pretty sparsely populated in general.
Now, did Gregory Lone live there in Wenatchee, Washington?
Yes.
Yes.
He had been, I think, as far as I understand, reasonably established in the town before we started this case.
And Adam, you mentioned a little bit about Lone's professional background in the beginning in securities and insurance. Can you tell me, how did he come about owning the business and having a relationship with his victims?
Yeah, Mr. Lone had bought out the book of business of a guy named Walt Ness, who was a pretty long-time insurance agent in the Wenatchee area. And so he had been, in business for, I think, multiple decades. And so when he was looking at transitioning to retirement, Mr. Lone essentially bought his client list, and he used that list to carry out his fraud. But that was the main way that he got connected with the folks who ended up being the victims in this case.
Okay. And how long had the business that he purchased, the book of business, how long had it been around?
Yeah, a long time, couple decades, I think.
Oh, wow.
And how did the Washington State Securities Division first learn about this case?
We had gotten a referral from our federal counterparts, the Securities and Exchange Commission. So they had alerted us to some information that they received about a potential victim who lived in the Wenatchee area and may have been defrauded by Mr. Lone. And so they gave me the name, phone number, contact information for that person. That was how it initially came in the door.
And this is for Michelle or Adam. Tell us about what Lone was offering to his clients. Was it, for instance, cryptocurrency? Was it stocks like Microsoft? What was he offering?
I believe he did stock, annuities, life insurance policies, as I recall.
There were annuities, I think. Yeah, it was different victim to victim. So generally how it would work would be someone who used to work with Walt Ness would have a pretty big pot of money, from selling a house or an inheritance or, something like that. And they would call up, the guy who used to be their insurance agent and say, "Hey, Walt, I got all this money. What should I do with it?" And, Mr. Lone would say, "Oh, well, Walt's retired, but I'm Greg and I've taken over his business. Let's see what we can do for you." Mm-hmm. And so they would bring him, what they were looking for in an investment, essentially. And then what he would sell them is something that sounded like it matched what they were looking for, but was in fact completely made up, more or less.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you mentioned annuities earlier. For some of our listeners who may not know what that is, what is an annuity?
So an annuity is issued by an insurance company, and essentially what it is a stream of future income. So just as kind of a rough example, I might give an insurance company $100,000 and they say, "We will pay you back annually at a 5% rate on that initial $100,000. And so I would then get, whatever 5,000 divided by 12 months is, I would get that every month for the full term of the annuity. So that could be, a specified period, like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, could be my entire life. But yeah, so an annuity is essentially a stream of guaranteed income payments from an insurance company.
Did he have any partners or employees?
He was a solo shop, I think.
Yeah, I thought his son may have been involved, but we couldn't.
Yeah, we never
just in the business.
Yeah, I don't think we ever fully nailed that down. To the extent that he had anyone else there, it would have been like sort of a token administrative thing. But I don't think he had anyone else working directly under him.
Was he properly licensed by the Washington State Office of the Insurance Commissioner?
Yeah, I believe he was. Yeah, he was doing some stuff where he should have been licensed by us and wasn't. But yeah, he was, as far as I understand, appropriately licensed for the insurance stuff that he was doing.
And was he fairly new to selling securities?
No, so he'd worked in like the late 90s through early 2000s. in the securities industry. I think most recently for Edward Jones from, I believe, '04 to '06. And he was discharged from Edward Jones for failing to meet his performance goals there. And so he had not been registered in the securities industry since that point.
Let's talk a little bit more about the victims. What were they told, and how did Gregory Lone market his scheme to them?
It was generally different investor to investor. So like I said, people most commonly would have, a pretty good pot of cash that they wanted to invest, and would take that to Mr. Lone and tell him what they were looking for, and he would pitch them something that he said would meet what they were looking for, but was in fact just him paying them back with other people's money, or sometimes it was just completely made up. So there was one guy who thought he was getting a Bitcoin related fund. There were a couple folks who thought they were buying annuities. There was one lady who thought she was getting a more diversified stock portfolio. So he was pretty good at tailoring his pitch to what that particular person was looking for.
Do we know how many victims are involved in the scam?
There were 7 victims.
Yeah. As I recall, 6 of them were in their 80s or 90s.
Most of those either lived in assisted care facilities or assisted living facilities, or had caregivers in the home, in-home care. One in particular was blind and fairly immobile. So her caregiver was there quite throughout, for most of the day and in a 24-hour period. All elderly, widowed, or married, certainly retired, wanted to protect their investment. Although the money was new money to them, they still wanted to protect their investment, income streams with annuities, that sort of thing.
Do we have any idea how much money was lost?
It's approximately $660,000, which for Wenatchee is a fair amount of money. Had this been on the west side of the state, it would have been a hard sell, in my opinion, to get this to a prosecutor to actually look at it, let alone dive into it. It's just not enough money on this side of the state to get the curiosity up and running.
And Adam and Michelle, you told us a little bit about the victims, that a lot of them were elderly or they were in assisted living homes. How did Lone meet the victims?
Yeah, so generally it would be some sort of reach out to Walt Ness, essentially, the guy whose book of business that he bought. And then, he would generally set up a meeting with them if they contacted him and said, "Hey, I have this money that I want to invest."
Yeah, so he didn't really solicit them on the initial. The victims actually reached out to whom they thought could help them invest the money.
Yeah.
So he kind of fell into it.
Yeah, and that's a little different, I would say, than a lot of the cases we investigate, because I would say it's much more common for fraudsters to be going around and actively soliciting people, through networks, through other investors. Just they are playing a much more active role in going out and trying to find money versus just kind of having it come to them, like Mr. Lone was doing.
Did he defraud all of his clients?
No, just as we've said, the ones that had some new money that came into their possession, and they looked to invest it, diversify it, make them some money on it. So no. Yeah,
it was very much a targets of opportunity sort of thing.
It fell into his lap.
Did Lone did his family know what he was doing?
We don't think so. I think his kids are now not on good terms with him. I think that was part of what we learned around the sentencing phase. But so his family does not seem to have been aware of it now.
Now, when did his victims start asking questions?
It really wasn't until we were investigating and reaching out to them. So the case actually started with, like I said, that SEC referral. And so I had contacted the victim and spoken to her by phone, and then traveled over to Central Washington the following day to interview her in person and look at some of the documents that she had gotten from Mr. Lone. But it was, and then, so based off of that, we were able to obtain what we thought was a list of other possible investors through a subpoena for Mr. Lone's bank records, or his company's bank records, I should say. And then we started making calls to other folks who looked like they may have invested with Mr. Lone, and people were surprised to hear from us, I would say, and often were questioning why we were reaching out, and there's a little bit of resistance in a couple cases to talking with us during those initial stages.
Do we know what he was using the money for?
Yes, he was using it to pay other investors. That was why we met up with some resistance. It's because, one, they didn't think anything was wrong, and two, they didn't want the money to stop, which was an interesting perspective that I hadn't ran into. Normally people want, yes, we'd like our income to not stop, but we also want to help out when there's wrongdoing that's happening, but we didn't really hear that. He used to purchase a car. There was a home remodel, just regular personal use of everyday items, grocery shopping, that sort of thing. And then he did open this winery. So we had a lot of expenses related to construction of either the winery and or his home remodel. So it was an out and out Ponzi scheme, and then just misuse for personal reasons.
Yeah.
What was Lone's end game?
I don't know that he had much of a plan. So when we interviewed him, so ultimately towards the end stages of the case, we had referred it to a detective in the police department over there. And I interviewed him together with that detective. And his story was basically that the lady that he initially defrauded, he had gotten, I think, a $200,000 payment from her, and then pretty much immediately began paying her back with her own money while falsely telling her that she had an annuity from a legitimate insurance company, when in fact it was just she was getting paid from Paramount, from his company's bank account. And so, sorry, what was the question again? I kind of lost the thread there.
Just what was his end game?
Yeah.
What was his motivation, too, for the scheme?
Yeah, so his story, when I talked to him with the detective, was that he had planned to use that money from this initial victim to kind of just get the business off the ground, and thought he would be able to pay her back with just, legitimate earnings from the business. And, I think he's probably not the first person to try that. And ultimately, it almost never really works out for people who try it. And eventually, he just had to keep digging the hole deeper and deeper and start defrauding other people to continue to be able to pay this lady back. And so, yeah, the end game when he started out seems to have been build up my business to be able to, repay these people without getting in hot water. And it did not work. I'll put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
When did Lone first learn that he was being investigated?
When the detective reached out, there might have been some rumblings about it. There was one victim whose son was pretty heavily involved and had, made some, I think, legal threats towards Lone about repaying the money. So it wouldn't surprise me if he had clued Lone in that, his mother had been interviewed by people from the state and they were questioning whether he was running a Ponzi scheme. But yeah, I think I would be pretty comfortable saying that once the detective reached out to him for an interview, that he probably knew the jig was up at that point.
And when I got involved and we interviewed investors over there, we actually did so with the detective. So if there wasn't an underlying kind of rumble, there certainly was after that point, because we're showing up with the police and conducting the interview, and it was quite eye-opening for them. And they were definitely aware at that point, so I wouldn't be surprised if that got back to him.
Yeah.
Is there any idea of how he reacted to being investigated?
He did come in for the interview with the detective, so, a lot of people don't do that. Yeah, he came in and was, I would say, reasonably forthcoming. I think he was maybe misdirecting us a little bit about, how much he really thought he could get out of it and how viable he thought that was. But yeah, he did come in and talk to us. I'll give him that.
And I think it's also fair to say, too, or at least bring up, that in the cases that I have worked on, this was one of the most straightforward Ponzi schemes and misuse of funds. It doesn't take a whole lot of, not that I haven't done this before and this is my first gig, but it doesn't take a rocket science to figure this one out of what was happening. Mm-hmm. So I've even stated that it's a good one for training purposes because it was just very simple to see money coming in and going out to not what it was supposed to and paying other people. So if he would have been shown this information, the writing would have been on the wall that we know the gig. You should know the gig is up because we discovered what you've been doing.
Yeah.
So,
and just to elaborate a little bit on what Michelle was saying, a lot of the time there are multiple bank accounts involved, and the incoming funds will often be commingled with the funds that are gained from fraud, and so oftentimes it can be difficult to and separate those out and say, like, okay, well, this was real business they were doing over here, but then over at this point, this is fraud. And so it can often be very, very difficult. I would say maybe the most difficult part of our cases is sort of disambiguating and disentangling those things. But this one, it was pretty straightforward, to the extent that he had any sort of legitimate revenue, it was pretty minimal. And there was just one bank account in the name of his company, and he was using it for personal expenses. It was pretty obvious, even from a cursory look at it, that was what was going on.
And the commission income he received from his legitimate business could clearly not support his expenses going out. So there had to have been another source, which were the investors' funds.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And going back to his cooperation, so besides doing the interview with the detectives, did Lone cooperate in any other way? So, for instance, did he at least attempt to mitigate any of the damages for victims, or did he attempt to pay them back? Was there any other cooperation?
So there was discussion that I'm going to pay you, but it never came about.
Yeah. Do you remember if he actually, were there folks in there that got paid back? Because I feel like there was at least one lady who got. There was another lady who I think had thought that she was getting some kind of annuity, and then had raised some issues with him, and then I think she had gotten paid back with other investors' money. But I would say that was more the trying to keep the scheme going than a legitimate attempt at making things right.
Did he seem remorseful during the investigation at all?
It's always hard to tell with these, just because, the people we investigate are very often good at performing the sorts of emotions they're expected to perform, right? And so I would say my read on it was that he was more sorry he got caught and maybe felt a little bit bad, but not really in I think the sense that you or I would if we got caught up in one of these sorts of things. But again, I can't see into his head, so maybe that's a little ungenerous, but that was kind of my read on it from interacting with him.
Okay. Can you tell me what were some of the challenges during the case, even from an investigative standpoint? Were the victims willing and cooperative? Was the evidence easy to uncover? I think you mentioned that the financials, at least, were pretty clear-cut.
Yeah. So Michelle had touched on this a little bit earlier, but one tricky thing we had is that initial victim. So she had, I believe, was a 95-year-old woman living in an assisted living facility, and she had given him $200,000 to get what she thought was an annuity from a legitimate insurance company, and so she was getting payments on that. She was getting paid back with some combination of her own money and money from subsequent investors, but he was paying her. And that money was helping her to, continue to live in that facility. And so she was a little bit reluctant at first to talk to us, basically just for fear of upsetting the apple cart and cutting off that sort of payments that she really didn't need. So she did ultimately talk to us and cooperate during the investigation. But that was sort of a tricky aspect of it, was that, that money, oftentimes people need that to live on and are willing to shield their eyes a little bit about where it's actually coming from.
Okay. What was the outcome of the trial?
He ended up pleading guilty, and the most interesting part of this case, I thought, was that there was actually an agreed sentence between the prosecution and the defense of 3 years, which I thought was maybe a little bit light, but given I think particularly the elderly victims was something that really raised my hackles. But ultimately, that's not my call. It's the prosecutor and the defense attorney's call, and ultimately the judge's call. Because what happened after that was that there were a couple of sentencing hearings that got continued, and a big part of why they got continued is that Lone's victims included, in an unrelated thing like a decade earlier, his parents and his sister. So he had also defrauded them, in something that was not at all related to this Ponzi scheme, entirely separate thing. But they got wind of this and went into court to say, we think you should put Greg away for much longer than 3 years. And so what ended up happening after a couple of continuances was that he got sentenced to 8 years instead of the originally agreed 3. And the judge said something like, I can count on one hand the number of times I've departed from an agreed sentence, and I'm doing it here. And he went on to explain why. And so, yeah, Lone was not happy about that. I believe he's appealing that sentence, and that is still pending. So whether or not that ultimately ends up being his sentence, we will see. But yeah, that was, I think, very gratifying for us.
Was he ordered to pay back any restitution?
He was approximately $480,000.
Yeah, I believe that's correct. Yeah, and I mean, whether he's ultimately going to be able to do that, it's pretty rare in these types of things for the losses to actually end up getting remediated. But the order is out there.
What was his demeanor like during the sentencing?
When he heard the 8-year sentence, he kind of just like hinged at the waist and like fell forward. It's hard to describe it, but yeah, he looked like, those like birds that you put on the edge of a cup that kind of like bobs down into the water. He looked like one of those.
The time when we weren't there physically, we were zoomed in, so we had several screens of the judge and the prosecutor and the defense, and the defense attorney and the defendant, and so we saw everything via video. So seeing him fall over like that was just quite entertaining to me.
What are some tips investors can learn from this case to help them from becoming victims of fraud?
2 big things I think that I would start with. One is making sure that your financial professional is appropriately registered to do the sorts of things they're saying they can do for you. So I had mentioned earlier that Mr. Lone was registered with the Office of the Insurance Commissioner, was not and should have been registered with our office in order to do securities-related stuff. And so that can be tricky to tell just as an everyday person. Like, the financial industry is pretty complicated, and it's often not clear who regulates what or what capacity people need to be registered in. Making sure that, the person is registered for what they're saying they're registered to be able to do. And so if they're dealing in stocks or bonds or anything in that neighborhood, they need to be registered with the appropriate securities regulator. And so when this case came in the door initially, that first that first victim that I had interviewed, she had thought that she was getting her big portfolio of Microsoft stock, about $180,000 that she had inherited from her son who predeceased her. So Lone had told her that he was going to get her a better, more diversified stock portfolio. And if she had looked and seen the check with our office and about whether Mr. Lone was actually authorized to do any sort of stock-related transactions, she would have learned that he was, in fact, not, despite the fact that his company was named Paramount Financial Advisors. And so that kind of leads to my second point, which is just knowing what the paperwork looks like and having some sense for when something looks really, really slapdash, amateurish. So when I went over and I spoke to this lady on the phone, I hadn't seen any of her documents yet. This is the legally blind woman that Michelle had mentioned earlier that had a regular, visits from a friend down the street to assist her with just daily tasks and things. And so I think she had maybe not looked at the documents as closely as either I would, probably largely due to being legally blind. I think that can probably not help you out there a ton. But she gave me the documents that Mr. Lone had given her, and I looked at the first document, which was supposedly a trade confirmation for the Microsoft stock. And I have never been more sure, just from looking at one document in a case, that someone was going to end up going to jail, because this trade confirmation for the Microsoft stock could not more clearly have been made in Microsoft Word. And that is not something that actual broker-dealers do. They have their own systems and are not,
No letterhead.
Yeah, no letterhead of any kind.
Official looking.
If you looked at the time that was listed, it didn't match the trading price at the listed time that the transaction supposedly occurred. So a lot of things going on like that. And then there was also an account statement that he gave her that was, again, this one was Excel, not Word. But same kind of thing where you look at it and you go, this does not look like any legitimate statement I've ever seen from any legitimate broker-dealer. And so just sort of being on the lookout for if the paperwork looks weird. And I will add, we are very happy to take a look at your paperwork and tell you if it looks weird. We cannot give you legal advice or financial advice in general, but if you take paperwork to your local securities regulator, they will be more than happy to look up for you, what functions someone is licensed to perform, and then whether, a given set of paperwork looks consistent with the sorts of things that we see from legitimate broker-dealers, or maybe is something you should be asking some questions about.
Well, and in my experience in other cases that have also went criminal and the defendant is remanded to jail, even just contacting the issuer of the investment would be helpful. If you think you're investing in some annuity with Nationwide Insurance, as this one was, as I recall, contact Nationwide. Make sure that you actually have an account there. In the cases I've had in the past, we've had people, they didn't have accounts where they believed they did because the statements were fake. So when payments become late, when the documents are late or delayed or they don't look official, look to whom you're supposed to be investing in, not just with, but in, to see, in fact, they have your money, they have your account. It's where it's supposed to be. I think that would be a good first step, just to make sure it's what you think you have, you actually do.
Yeah, and especially with annuities, I'd add to that, because the whole point of annuities is that they're supposed to be consistent, regular. You get X dollars on the first of the month, every month.
Timely.
That's the whole point of them, more or less. And so if payments from your insurance company start being late, well, that's not what an insurance company is supposed to do, and that should be setting off some alarms for you.
Do you have any additional tips for our listeners on how they can avoid becoming victims of fraud?
Do your research, do your due diligence. Don't just because someone is investing that it must be a good thing and they're making money, so it must be legitimate. Do your own research. Check with your local offices like DFI and the SEC as far as the federal government goes. Check things out. Like I said, contact issuers. Make sure that in fact you have invested in what you believe you invested in. In this case, and in other cases I've seen, we've had checks actually written to the perpetrator. That's not normal. You don't write a check to an individual when you're investing in an annuity. You should be writing it to the issuer. Those things, and in other cases, have panned out to be criminal activity. They deposited those checks into their personal and or business accounts and have used them for their own personal use. So just not taking, we go back to the same old saying, if it's too good to be true, it is. And every day we have cases that just comes to fruition every day. I wish people would listen to that and do it. Just stop for just a minute and take the time to save yourself a lot of headache and loss of funds, and could be your entire retirement, as we've seen in some instances that's gone and likely not going to be retrieved.
Yeah, I think everything Michelle said there was really good. I would just kind of dovetail off of that. Just trust your instincts. Like if something looks weird, or like Michelle said, sounds too good to be true, there are ways you can go and check that out. And there should be, independent third parties that you can go to verify the claims that the person selling you the investment is making. And so oftentimes, like Michelle said, you can call up if you think you have an annuity through Nationwide. You can call them up and see if you're actually in their system, or you can contact the regulator and ask if the person is appropriately licensed. Have them look at the paperwork. And I will add to that, if the financial professional in question discourages you from doing those sorts of checks, that should set off a big red siren for you, because that's not something that a legitimate professional will do. They'll be, it might be a little extra paperwork for them or what have you, but they will generally be happy to have you go to verify that what they're saying is true, because that's what honest and legitimate business people do.
Right. Well, thank you, Adam and Michelle. At least my final question for you, Jeremy may have other questions. How would you say that this case is similar or different from any of the other cases you've worked on or investigated?
For me, it was one of the smaller cases. Just having one bank account was fairly interesting. Normally, I have several that I have to figure out what happens to the funds and all the transfers and the movement of funds commingling. So in that respect, it was a little simpler. And in terms of the use of the funds, that was very ordinary. It went to pay other investors. It went for personal use, misuse of funds. So in that regard, it was very similar to the cases that I have had experience with.
Yeah, I think a couple of interesting angles on this one for me one was that Lone was actually pretty good about not making the promises too extravagant, right? So, say that lady who had initially...
Just believable enough.
Yeah, say that lady had initially invested $200,000 in an annuity, and he had come back and said, you'll get $100,000 a year off of this for the rest of your life. Like, that's the kind of thing that I think would set off some red flags for most people. But, he had restricted it to something more in the neighborhood of, I think it was $2,700 a month for payments, which was, as it turns out, better than the rates you could actually get for annuities at that time. But, it's not a number that sounds crazy to the average person, right? You invest $200,000, you're like, $2,700, that's not that much. I feel like I should be able to get that. And so that I thought was, despite the pretty shoddy nature of the documentation that he was creating, I think that's a big part of why he was able to sort of keep this going was that it sounded, at least verbally, like a pretty real thing. And then I think another lesson in this one is that this stuff eventually does catch up with you. So like I said, Lone's parents and sister testified against him at sentencing and said that he should be going to jail for longer. That's not something that perpetrators' families normally do. Normally the families say, oh, he's a great guy and he just got in a bad situation and dug himself in a little too deep. But, even if you do not face immediate consequences for defrauding your family or close friends, it can still come back to bite you years later and could result in you going to jail for almost 3 times as long as you thought you were going to.
So how can someone check the background of a person making the investment offer? Go to nasa.org. That's NASA.org and click Contact Us, and then click Contact NASA Member to then choose your jurisdiction's regulator. Being an informed investor means having a plan and understanding each of your investments. Whether you're new to investing or already investing, NASA and its members provide a variety of online investor education resources for investors of all ages. Go to nasa.org for more information on how to be a wise and safe investor. Thank you both for joining us and for the work that you do to protect investors. That is it for today, and from Olympia, Washington, I'm Jeremy Lushine.
From Salt Lake City, Utah, I'm Francois Grayson. If you have any questions about today's episode or would like more information about the topics discussed, you can email us at realliferegulators@gmail.com. That's realliferegulators@gmail.com. And if you would like to hear future episodes, please hit the subscribe button.
NASA provides its information as a service to investors. It's neither a legal interpretation nor an indication of a policy position by NASA or any of its members. If you have questions concerning the meaning or application of a particular state or provincial law, rule, or regulation, please consult an attorney that specializes in securities law.